As tank, artillery and air battles rage across eastern Ukraine, on a scale not seen since the Second World War, Europe and America have reacted with alarm, scrambling to provide money, advice, weapons and ammunition to support the Ukrainian army. Russia has thrown thousands of tanks and armored combat vehicles into the war. High on the wish list of Ukrainian President Zelensky's generals was always the M1A2 Abrams main battle tank. On 25th of January 2023, US President Joe Biden announced that 31 Abrams tanks would be sent to Ukraine. But how will a tank that was designed in the 1970s and first fielded in the mid-1980s fare against significantly upgraded Russian tanks in the third decade of the 21st century? Is Vladimir Putin right to be terrified of the M1 Abrams? Let's crunch some of the numbers and get a sense of where the Abrams comes from, what it can do, how it might make an impact on the battlefields of Ukraine, and why Vladimir Putin should be afraid. To understand the birth of the Abrams and its current variant, the M1A2, we need to go right back to the Cold War, between 1945 and 1990, where NATO and the Soviet Union were squaring up against each other in Central Europe. Throughout these decades, the most likely conflict between the two sides seemed to be a massive ground war fought in West Germany. In the 1970s, the main American battle tank, the M60, was becoming obsolete. A replacement was needed, one that was designed for high mobility in modern armored ground warfare and that could defeat the latest generation of Soviet armor. Some early US-German collaboration looked at producing a tank together. The Germans were also looking to replace the Leopard 1, but this MBT-70 program was expensive and the tank design problematic. American designers started again. In 1973, at the heart of the requirements for a new tank were that it could survive a strike by a Soviet tank gun at 800 meters and mount a 105mm main armament. Proposals came in from Chrysler and General Motors. There were several issues to be considered. The Chrysler proposal had a gas turbine engine, while the General Motors design offered a diesel. This had implications for cost and reliability. In the mid-1970s, there was considerable interest in a new British defensive composite armor innovation called Cobham armor, which through a clever and highly classified technique of layering ceramic tiles and open spaces in such a way as to channel, deflect, and dissipate the intense heat and impact of an anti-tank round. Although early models of the new tank design that would become the Abrams M1 mounted a 105mm gun, it was soon clear that a 120mm would be much more potent. The armored warfare doctrine of the time emphasized being able to strike the enemy at long range before he could get in a first shot. It seems that for most of the evaluation process, the General Motors demonstration model was favored. However, at the last minute, the decision was overturned by then Secretary of Defense Donald Rumsfeld, who wanted to hear all the arguments again. He finally decided in favor of the Chrysler version. There may have been a bit of DC politics involved. The M1 tank acquired an official name Abrams after General Creighton Abrams, a former tank commander in Patton's Third Army in the Second World War, and who had worked hard in the 1960s and 70s to push forward US main battle tank design. The original M1 Abrams tank came into service in 1980. Over 3,000 were produced between 1979 and 1985, many with a 105mm gun. But a few years later, the M1 was being replaced by an upgraded version, the M1A1. These all had a 120mm main gun. Nearly 5,000 M1A1s were produced between 1986 and 1992, 4,000 for the American Army and 400 for the US Marines. Each tank cost over $4 million. The Abrams has a crew of 4 and weighs 57 tons, although different models can weigh as much as 78 tons. It can reach speeds of 67 kilometers an hour and has a range of 465 kilometers. The M829A2 armor-piercing shell can deal with newer Russian tanks, the T-80 and T-90, which have Contact 5 explosive reactive armor, ERA. In addition to the 120mm main armament, the Abrams mounts a coaxial machine gun and a 50 caliber heavy machine gun on top of the turret. The Abrams is heavier than most current main battle tanks and it's bulky, but it's also quite agile. One nickname it has acquired is Whispering Death, because the gas turbine engine is relatively quiet. The Abrams also had a lot of safety features designed specifically to protect the crew. Crew survivability has always been an important part of the Abrams design concept. The crew is always the most precious asset of any tank, so the tank ammunition is stored in the back compartment of the tank turret and carefully sealed away from the crew. This has turned out to be a vital design innovation. Social media is now full of clips of Russian tanks in Ukraine catastrophically exploding, their turrets flung up into the air because the ammunition is stored, unprotected, in the crew compartment. The M1A1 has improved defenses. Now the composite armor also includes screens of heavy depleted uranium and twin sets of smoke discharges. Some models have anti-missile jamming measures. The rear of the turret has blowout panels to redirect blast in the event of ammunition explosions. The crew interior has Kevlar lining around the turret to protect against spalling, which is caused when high-velocity rounds strike the outside of the tank and cause fragments of metal to flake off at high speed and bounce around inside the tank. This thing is combat-proven. Here's what we mean. The M1 Abrams crews spent years of training during the 1980s in the wooded, mountainous, and population-heavy arena of Germany as they prepared to conduct defensive operations against a Soviet assault. It was highly ironic, therefore, that the Abrams' first actual combat deployment was in an offensive role in the unpopulated deserts of the Middle East. Nearly 2,000 Abrams were sent to the Gulf to help force Saddam Hussein's army out of Kuwait. The Abrams performed excellently and was superior to the Iraqi T-55s, T-62s, and even the relatively modern T-72s that equipped Saddam's army. The Abrams were highly mobile, easy to operate, and had highly advanced command, communications, and fire control systems that enabled small numbers of Abrams to speedily maneuver, engage, and defeat many times more Soviet-model tanks at greater ranges. Hits against Iraqi armor were achieved as far as 4 kilometers away. Soviet tanks struggled to achieve half that distance. The Battle of Easting 73 was but one example of the flexible firepower that the Abrams could bring to bear. During the whole Gulf War, although some were hit by friendly fire and some had to be destroyed to prevent them falling into enemy hands, few Abrams were hit by enemy action, and none were destroyed. Of a force of nearly 2,000, only 23 were damaged or destroyed. The Abrams was clearly more than a match for Soviet-era armor. Okay, now let's talk about improvements, combat lessons, and also challenges. Modifications to the Abrams were made as a result of lessons learned during the Gulf War. Improvements were made to the fire control system and weapon sights, but the innovations kicked up several notches when the new M1A2 version of the Abrams was revealed. Development work had begun in 1988, and the first models were produced in 1992. This was a significant evolution of the Abrams platform. The tank commander now had an independent thermal viewer and a weapon station and navigation equipment. The fire control system was again upgraded. Many of the improvements involved adding more computer and data management capacity. This also meant that the internal cooling system needed to be upgraded because of the extra heat generated by the new IT systems. More combat lessons were learnt the hard way during the 2003 Second Gulf War, also known as the Iraq War, and the insurgency aftermath. Further modifications to the Abrams were made. For instance, combat identification panels were important to help reduce the risk of friendly fire incidents. There were some tank-on-tank engagements before the Saddam regime collapsed. In one incident, Abrams tanks destroyed 7 T-72s in a matter of minutes at very close range. The Iraqi tank crews were poorly trained and unable to react with sufficient speed. Having strong situational awareness and good communications is every bit as important as having thick armor and a big gun. Since the creation of the tank in 1916, all tank crews have struggled to achieve all-round ease of visibility. It's simply very difficult to see what you're doing, whether driving, firing a gun, or commanding a tank in battle, when peering out of a narrow vision slit. This has always made tanks vulnerable at night or in enclosed areas, such as forests and urban areas. Ideally, the commander sits with his head out of the turret so he can clearly see in every direction from a high position, but he is then, of course, at high risk of getting targeted by a sniper. Urban fighting in Iraq against terrorists and local militia forces caused major problems for the Abrams and the crews. The Abrams was highly vulnerable to close-up infantry creeping up on the side and rear of the vehicle, hiding in alleys and buildings. They were armed with rocket-propelled grenades, anti-tank guided missiles, mines, IEDs, and even a heavy machine gun or a simple petrol bomb. At short range, many of these weapons could be sufficient to knock a tank out or damage it sufficiently in order to cause it to retire or be abandoned. You certainly do not have to destroy a tank in order to render it ineffective. Missiles were fired at tracks and wheels. Rocket-propelled grenades struck the less well-protected top and rear of the tank. Some parts of a tank are very vulnerable. Pieces of communications equipment and vision slits can be damaged and reduce the effectiveness of the tank. Even a brick can damage a radio aerial. Some Abrams had to be hastily abandoned when extra fuel stored on the outside of the tank burst into flames. This time the conflict was primarily in an urban environment, and there was little opportunity for the Abrams to play to its strengths, engaging enemy vehicles at long range. The Abrams was a child of the Cold War, intended to face heavily armed threats to its front. Total losses inflicted on Abrams tanks during this second Gulf War were much more sobering to contemplate. By 2005, 80 tanks had been put out of action, of which 63 had to be returned to America for major repairs, and 17 were so damaged that they had to be written off as beyond repair. Nearly 2 years later, more than 500 Abrams had been returned to the US for repair work as a result of the combat in Iraq. In 2008, a particular Russian anti-tank rocket-propelled grenade, the RPG-29, was considered a very serious threat to the Abrams. Its innovative missile design gave it a double charge, which allowed it to first penetrate the reactive armor and then also the composite armor underneath it. In accordance with the lessons learnt in Iraq, a new modification kit was introduced, specifically designed to deal with the particular vulnerabilities that the Abrams was experiencing in the grueling city fighting. It was called Tusk, the Tank Urban Survival Kit. There was also a Tusk II kit. The Tusk program offered a series of modules and components that could be fitted to the tank or removed according to the tactical situation the crew was facing. The kits provided improved protection, extra firepower, and better situational awareness. Some of the features included add-on reactive armor, extra smoke and anti-personnel grenade discharges, transparent protection around the commander's heavy machine gun position, a thermal sight for the machine gun, 360-degree and rear-fitted cameras, and a telephone at the back of the tank to allow direct communication with the accompanying infantry. Slat armor could be added. These are forms of cages or metal grills around particularly vulnerable parts of the tank, such as the rear and crew areas. The Russians have been experimenting with these in Ukraine. But in poorly trained hands, the Abrams could be just as vulnerable as any other tank. From 2010, the Americans equipped the new Iraqi army with a vast array of combat equipment. 140 M1A1 Abrams were given to the Iraqi Defense Forces. In 2014, they were used against ISIS. However, within 3 months, over 40 of the tanks had been destroyed, damaged, or captured. At the end of 2014, the Iraqi army had only 40 Abrams tanks still operational. It's a useful reminder that the skills, training, morale, and capabilities of the crew remain at the heart of the effectiveness of the Abrams. Other packages of upgrades, separate enhancement packages (SEP), versions 1, 2, and 3, have been introduced to increase the capabilities and lifespan of the M1A1 and M1A2. The crew have received better digital maps, better interfaces, an improved cooling system, a remotely operated weapons system, and better front and side armor. But the enhancements themselves are causing problems. The weight of the tank is slowly creeping upwards. The original weight of the M1 was set at 50 tons. Enhancement packages can take the latest version of the M1A2 to well over 70 tons. There is a limit to the amount of improvements that can be made. The more weight the tank is carrying, the less mobile it will be. The more high-technology add-ons and lower-technology armor upgrades that are introduced, the more difficult, costly, and complex it becomes to service the tank. The Abrams is undeniably old, and there is no Abrams replacement yet in sight, meaning the Abrams will have to remain the US main battle tank for many more years. A study in October 2023 by the US Army Science Board concluded that the M1 Abrams would not be sufficient to support combat missions from 2040 onwards. That seems a long way away, but the Abrams is a third-generation main battle tank, and researchers and designers are now contemplating what a fifth-generation tank would look like, and urgently updating these views based on what they are learning from the war in Ukraine. At present, the view seems to be that the new tanks will need to be lighter, with a hybrid propulsion, larger guns, hypersonic missiles, and more effective passive and active protection systems. Advanced radar and sensors will make for a more and more transparent domain. It will become easier to detect weapons, see and strike targets on the battlefield. As we noted earlier, in January 2023, President Joe Biden announced that over 30 Abrams tanks would be sent to Ukraine, and that they would be the more up-to-date M1A2 versions. This sent ripples of excitement throughout the Western world and caused serious concern within the Kremlin. In late September 2023, Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky confirmed that all 31 had arrived. Well, first of all, we should probably take a look at the political angles that can dominate and dictate the progress of a conflict. Western countries are generally highly and actively supportive of the Ukrainian cause, but there have also been expressions of concern that Putin should not be overly provoked. This concern has changed slowly. The nature of the brutality of the Russian assault and the extensive numbers of human rights abuses has quickly become clear. Ukraine is fighting for its very existence. Billions of dollars of aid have already been sent to Ukraine. Other weapons systems have followed. Ukraine has received hundreds of armored personnel vehicles, cross-country vehicles, mobile artillery pieces, small arms ammunition, artillery shells, helmets, first aid kits. America and many EU countries have provided intelligence support and military training in a range of ways. One problem is that Ukraine is receiving so many different types of equipment from so many different countries that training, maintenance, and logistics are proving a significant challenge. However, this has been slightly alleviated by the high degree of standardization and interoperability between NATO countries, particularly regarding ammunition types. Ukraine was calling for military equipment from as soon as the conflict began in February 2022, but there was reluctance among NATO countries to hand over the most advanced NATO military hardware, such as F-16 fighter jets, main battle tanks, and long-range missiles, for fear of triggering Russian red lines and escalating the conflict. It was only well over a year after the war began that these more advanced systems began to arrive, and the quantities are still very small. 31 Abrams tanks is a relatively small amount, barely 2 American tank companies or 1 Ukrainian tank battalion. Being realistic, this is unlikely to make a significant military impact on a battlefield in which thousands of tanks are involved. So what would the strengths and weaknesses of the Abrams look like in a Ukrainian theater of war? The M1A2 and even the M1A1 with a package of upgrades would still present a very formidable opponent to the Russian armor currently being destroyed in their thousands by the Ukrainian army. Most of the tanks fielded by the Russians are upgraded versions of the same T-72 platform that the Abrams easily defeated during the Gulf War. Many are older. Other Russian tanks present, albeit in smaller numbers, are the T-80U and the T-90. The Abrams is more than a match for these vehicles, and in many ways, the Abrams has been training all its life for this battlefield confrontation. There have been many rumors that a highly capable new Russian main battle tank might be entering the Ukrainian battlefields. The T-14, seen on display during Russian victory parades for some years, was reported to be a highly advanced piece of equipment, with a 3-man crew and a remote-controlled turret, a new 125mm main armament that can fire anti-tank shells and anti-tank missiles, and carry an extensive array of very modern active defensive measures. This would have made it a 4th or even 5th generation tank, and it could have presented a very serious threat to the Abrams. But these reports seem to have been greatly exaggerated. It now seems likely that only a handful of non-battle-ready unfinished prototypes are in existence, and that the concept may never be put into full production. But let's now take a look at the battlefield environment. It's a high-intensity and high-casualty conflict, which evokes strong parallels from many parts of the last 100 years of warfare. We can see the brutal trench warfare and artillery barrages of the First World War. We can see examples of major armored, mechanized, and airborne operations that could have come straight out of the Second World War. And of course, we can see the cutting-edge technology of the most modern forms of warfare, including guided missiles, drones, electronic countermeasures, combat helicopters, and fast jets. In this mix, the main battle tank has struggled. There have certainly been many long-range instances of tank-on-tank combat, but thousands have fallen victim to artillery, cheap drones, and highly capable, man-portable anti-tank missiles. The vast array of sensors, including drones, satellites, handheld cameras, and social media, make camouflage and concealment of tanks and other armored vehicles very difficult. This combination of threats from drones, artillery, and missiles have caused many analysts to declare that the main battle tank, whether Russian, Ukrainian, or American, is now more or less obsolete. Russian tank and armored fighting vehicle losses have been absolutely staggering. United States intelligence assessments suggest that Russia may have lost 2,300 of the 3,500 tanks they have available. Cooler heads have since argued that it's far too early to make that call. Many of the Russian tank losses in particular were due to very poor offensive tactics, low morale, and a major design flaw, with the ammunition automatic loading carousel that effectively has the crew sitting right on top of the tank shells without any protection. The M1A2 would face the full array of combat challenges, just like any other main battle tank. drones, trenches, mines, artillery, anti-tank guided weapons, and guided missiles. Mines in particular have greatly reduced the mobility of all combat vehicles. Ukraine is now the most heavily mined place on Earth. On some parts of the front line, as many as 5 mines have been laid per square meter. But the Abrams is a well-designed and upgraded weapons platform that can move fast, protect the crew, and strike hard at the enemy. What would be crucial in enhancing the performance of the Abrams would be well-trained crews, solid tactics, and reliable maintenance and support. In Iraq, it was clearly demonstrated what happens if you give a top-of-the-range tank to a poorly trained crew with low morale. Giving the Abrams, or the Challenger 2 and Leopard 2 for that matter, to the Ukrainian army would also mean having to ensure that the Ukrainian tank crews, mechanics, and logisticians were also up to the correct standard in order to avoid seeing the tanks abandoned on the battlefield. So far, the Ukrainians have proven themselves highly skilled at adapting to operate many different modern American and European weapons systems, and their morale has always been high. But this does not guarantee success. Offensive combat operations in Ukraine are extremely difficult, dangerous, and costly, as both Russians and Ukrainians have found out. The Ukrainians are now quite realistic about the difficulties, particularly since their summer offensive operations were largely a disappointment, failing to drive the Russians back. America has also sent over 100 Bradley mechanized infantry combat vehicles to Ukraine, the type that accompanied Captain H.R. McMaster's Abrams tanks into the Battle of Easting 73 in 1991. The Ukrainians love them because they offer far superior protection to the crew than any equivalent ex-Soviet infantry combat vehicles could do, but as many as 24 Bradleys have been destroyed when they were used in the Ukrainian summer counter-offensive. The nature of modern warfare means that in order for a ground offensive to have a good chance of success, it needs effective air cover, accurate and responsive artillery support, and timely intelligence. It's a combination of weapon systems working together in close cooperation that wins battles. There are several pieces of American military equipment that will cause Vladimir Putin some major heart flutters. F-16 fighter jets in serious numbers would be one. Long-range guided missiles such as the US MGM-140 Army Tactical Missile Systems, ATACMS, are another. In terms of frontline ground combat, Putin's greatest fear would probably be to see significant quantities of M1A2 main battle tanks, by which we mean hundreds rather than dozens, arriving in Ukraine. This would mean several things. It would mean that any political concerns about provoking Putin and the strength of the resolve of the United States government would have been resolved in Ukraine's favor. It would show a strong political lead to the rest of Europe. It would reduce issues of training and problems of compatibility if the Ukrainian main tank force was comprised of the same tank type. If several hundred Abrams arrived, it would be fair to assume that they also would come with training, maintenance, and other logistical support packages. There are thousands of Abrams M1A1 and M1A2 main battle tanks in storage in the United States. Perhaps not quite an inexhaustible supply, but now probably enough to outnumber Russian tanks on the battlefield. The arrival of M1A2 would provide the Ukrainian armed forces with a war-winning, combat-proven tank that can defeat any Russian tank on the battlefield and give Ukraine a highly capable strike force to allow it to consider serious counterattack options. The Abrams will greatly increase Ukraine's chances of military success. And that is what will keep Mr. Putin awake at night. But what do you think? Will the M1A2 be a game changer for Ukraine in the Russo-Ukraine war? Let us know in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe for more military analysis from military experts.